Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter, the home of radical centrism, and the place for those of you who like your politics in colors other than red and blue. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And we have another radical centrist banger for you this week, folks. God bless you for that, Kaiser. Now, on May 16th, Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating, citing persistent large fiscal deficits. And last week, Congress responded by passing a budget that will add almost $4 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. So it looks like that worked. We are going to talk about the big, beautiful bill that just passed its big price tag and what this means for America's fiscal future. But first, Shawn, we're going to start out, as we always do, with our weekly PSA. First off, I would like to thank those of you who have subscribed to this podcast. It shows. And if you are one of our regular listeners, but not among the 73%, which I calculated this morning, Shawn, who have subscribed, this is your invitation to do so. Go ahead to your device right now, click the subscribe button. It means you get episodes as soon as they're released, and it also makes us more visible on podcast platforms to people like you. Number two, as I always say, Shawn and I started this podcast because we know there are more people like us who are frustrated with the two-party system, frustrated with inaction in Washington and wanting real change. So if you know anyone who thinks this way too, be sure to forward this podcast onto them. It'll help us grow this movement into something that can affect real change. So that's our PSA for the day. I'd also like to start off, before we get into the main story, Shawn, expressing yet again my frustration with how difficult it is to do a news commentary podcast in the Trump era. Because,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah,
absolutely.
So 2 weeks ago, we did the episode on the Georgia Senate race. Mm-hmm. Marjorie Taylor Greene was the suspected MAGA frontrunner for that race. We recorded that noon on Friday. So we record it noon Eastern time on Friday every week. 7 p.m. on Friday, Marjorie Taylor Greene announces she isn't going to run. Right. So there's that. Then last week, we do this episode on Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. Sunday, I get a text from you with a story about Joe Biden's cancer prognosis.
Yeah.
I got to thank you for sending that to me, by the way, because I had to tone down the title.
Yeah, obviously, we hope for the best for former President Biden. Regardless of what you think of that man, he has committed 4 years of his life to service to the United States, one way or another. And by all accounts, like from what I hear from people, he's a good man, right? You may disagree with him politically, but at the end of the day, cancer is no one should ever wish that on anybody. It's an awful thing. And obviously best wishes go to him and his family.
Well, again, I'll echo your sentiments. Best wishes to the Biden family. And of course, I would like to state for the record that we are flying amongst a gaggle of black swans in 2025. So we're recording this. This is a Friday. Something happens on Monday that just totally negates everything we're saying. Forgive us. We'll publish it anyway. So let's get into the main story. This past week, at the time of this recording, House passes their version of Trump's big, beautiful budget bill. It's no big surprises. There are massive tax cuts offset by cuts to social spending programs. There's a $4 trillion hike in the debt ceiling that lasts until 2027, which is really convenient. $150 billion increase in defense spending. I mean, there aren't any big surprises here. There was some wrangling between the fiscal hawks in the Freedom Caucus and the so-called SALT caucus of blue state Republicans. But other than that, it seemed to have passed without issue. What are your thoughts on this, Shawn?
So, if you just joined the podcast last week, you heard what we had to say about the Democratic Party, and you thought maybe we went a little hard on them. If you've been around since the start of this, you know that we lay into both sides when they deserve it, and especially as we exist within a political system that does not incentivize accountability. And what we saw this past week with the passage of the one big beautiful bill act, a name I hate for a number of reasons, we saw a very lack of that accountability to have a fiscal policy that is both sound and coherent and actually seeks to stabilize the issues that we have here in this country. And the issues I have with the title, not only because of the name itself, you have bill and act next to each other, which, I mean, they mean the same thing. So it's a little ridiculous. But the name itself speaks to everything that it's about. And that is that it was written and constructed for one man and his ego.
Yeah, agreed there. For those of you listening who aren't aware, the official name of the budget is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act,
Yeah.
to your point, which is a little redundant. We're going to overlook that because there are things far dumber in it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't really do that much for deficit and debt reduction. It really just sort of changes the route to fiscal oblivion. So as I mentioned at the top of the episode, adds 3.8 trillion to the debt over 10 years. And some of the cuts they're making are actually going to hurt Republican voters. So a great example is a lot of those Medicaid and safety net cuts are going to end up hurting rural hospitals, which already have a problem.
Right.
And number two, it doesn't address Medicare or Social Security, which are two of the biggest drivers of the debt and the deficit. And I think one thing that I'd like to make clear to the listener is at this point in time, discretionary federal spending as a percentage of GDP is at its lowest point since World War II. So we are spending less on your children's education. We are spending less on infrastructure. We are spending less on all of the things that will fund the future so we can finance consumption via Social Security and Medicare. And it's not to say that Social Security and Medicare shouldn't be funded, but the thing to keep in mind is that every time they talk about cutting spending, they are talking about cutting into investment into the future
Right.
and not talking about cutting what is effectively consumption.
And I think an important thing to note in this is that when you look at analysis from groups like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, as a result of increased deficit spending under this bill, we could see the deficit rise to 7% of GDP, which goes far in the opposite direction of what Trump's own Treasury Secretary has said deficit spending needs to be, which is at 3% of GDP for the debt to be stable. And as a result of this, in only a few years, the second biggest item on our federal budget will be interest payments on our own debt. It won't be Medicaid. It won't be defense spending. It will be interest payments, and it will be second only to Social Security.
And that's assuming that interest payments stay stable.
Yes.
Now, Moody's has already downgraded our credit rating. If the bond market gets spooked and we have to pay a higher interest rate, debt service payments as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the total budget, will rise. I've been looking around for parallels. One of the ones that's been drawn by some economists has been Liz Truss, former UK prime minister, served for about a day and a half. No, she was there for 44 days total. But her tenure consisted of releasing a budget with a bunch of unfunded tax cuts and energy subsidies. The bond markets totally freaked out. value of the pound dropped precipitously. It was at its lowest level against the dollar ever in history. She gets sacked, but the UK loses credibility with the bond markets, and they've kind of been suffering ever since. And it's an interesting parallel. It does show that there's a limit to which the bond market will put up with persistent deficits, but there are some big differences. So, first off, dollar is way more dominant than the pound. Our budgeting process is, believe it or not, transparent. So the Congressional Budget Office at least tells us everything we shouldn't like about this budget, whereas there wasn't that level of transparency with Truss in the UK. But the big one that I wanted to hone in on is the Fed, because the Fed is still viewed as a credible independent institution for now. Powell's term is up in 2026, so next year. And if Trump's choice for the next Federal Reserve chairperson is anything like his choices for cabinet positions, we're going to end up with a Trump lackey. And I have some big concerns about that, because if there's one thing that could spook bond markets in regards to US Treasuries, it would be a Federal Reserve that is viewed as less independent or viewed as subservient to Trump. And I have a hard time imagining he's going to appoint somebody really independent.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Moody's downgrade, and I think something that the reason why I think voters should pay close attention to this and why it's such a big warning sign, there are three big credit rating agencies that rate the U.S.'s sovereign debt. Moody's is one of them, S&P is another, and then Fitch. S&P and Fitch have already downgraded the United States to AA plus or AA1, whatever they call it. And Moody's, who began rating U.S. sovereign debt in 1917, first assigned the U.S. a AAA rating back in 1917. That hasn't changed until a couple weeks ago. For over 100 years, despite recessions, despite wars, despite so many reasons why they could downgrade our credit rating, that hasn't changed. And one thing to note about that is that S&P and Fitch, one of the contributing factors to that is political dysfunction in the United States. Moody's has always been a bit more tolerant of that, and because the things they consider more are the strengths in our economy that you had already mentioned. And so they have kind of overlooked the growing divide in our politics and persistent partisan gridlock for a while. However, that's getting so bad that they can't anymore. And our debt, in their opinion, which they warned back in March, that if we don't get our fiscal house in order and stabilize debt growth, then they were going to downgrade our credit rating. Well, I know. Look where we are now.
Well, yeah, and I think that's also worth noting is when S&P downgraded us back in 2011, 2012, it was partisan gridlock that they cited. Deficits were actually a minor concern, and if you remember, it was over a debt ceiling standoff. So they actually weren't so concerned about borrowing at the time. They were just concerned that we couldn't agree on anything. Now, it's we can't agree on anything, plus the persistent deficits we've been running. Now, the other interesting thing I find here is that, at least with the GOP, tax cuts will always trump real fiscal discipline. And tax hikes are entirely off the table. And this is something you and I have talked about time and time again. There are virtually zero ways to get the debt down to acceptable levels without tax cuts and reforms to Social Security and Medicare. And I'm going to give you some examples pulled right from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I know I have talked about this before on this podcast, so if this is redundant, forgive me, but I feel we have to talk about this. So right now, debt to GDP ratio is 121% and change, almost 122% in total. Now, according to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, we could cut $1 trillion from the deficit and bring the debt down to 115% by 2035 if we implemented a financial transaction tax of 0.01%, so that's $1 for every $1,000 bought or sold, restoring the estate tax to 2007 levels, so that means an exemption of 3.5 million for individuals and 7 million for couples, and then taxing capital gains as income for those making over $1 million. Right? So those three things, which affect a very small, very fortunate segment of Americans, could bring the debt down. Now, we could cut an additional $3 trillion from the deficit with an ultra-millionaire wealth tax. That would be a 2% tax on all net worth above 50 million, 3% on all wealth above 1 billion. And that, combined with the last set of tax hikes I talked about, would bring debt to GDP down to 108% by 2035. And I'm finding a tough time understanding how it is that a party that more and more represents people at the lower end of the income scale seems to be so averse to taxing a group of people who spend their fortunes on launching themselves into space and tilting elections.
The Republican Party, it dangles a lot of low-hanging fruit in front of working class Americans as to why they should support some of their policy positions, particular tax policy positions. Even when you look closely at it, it doesn't benefit the lower working class income workers as much as they want to sell it. Even the 2017 tax cut extension, it has a modest impact on middle income earners. It more benefits people who make the most money in the US. But then they dangle things like no tax on tips, which when you look at the fine print is not tax exemption, it's tax deduction. And when you really look at the number of tipped workers in the US that even pay federal income tax to begin with, you're only talking about a third of a workforce that makes up 2 to 3% of the United States' total workforce. So there's all these small little things they dangle in front of voters as, hey, look at this, get excited about this. But yeah, to your point, at the end of the day, it always seems like their policies will benefit the ultra wealthy as opposed to the very working class people they say they're supporting.
Yeah, and just to repeat another fact that we've said before, if you cut all discretionary spending, cut it all, cut the military, cut education, transportation, farm subsidies, everything, you're still running a deficit. You are running a deficit unless you touch Social Security and Medicare. So your only option is to either do all that or raise taxes. That's it.
Right.
That's it. So moving on a little bit, one of the things I was thinking about is how the US handled prior sovereign debt. Let's not call them crises, Shawn. What can we call them? Hiccups.
Yeah, maybe hiccups.
Incidents.
Yeah.
Incidents. So there are two. And in both instances, the US kind of defaulted. They don't call it a default, because if you call it a default, then of course, like, the world falls apart. So the first is with FDR. And this is one I didn't know until a couple of years ago. So 1933, Great Depression, there's economic uncertainty, obviously, banks are collapsing, and there's deflation. And it shakes people's faith in paper money. So Americans start exchanging their dollars for gold. You could do that back then. You could exchange your dollar for gold. Foreign investors see this, and they start doing the same thing. So FDR just suspends gold convertibility. Just says, your dollars are still worth gold, but you can't have the gold. That's effectively what he says, right? And then he gets sued. Supreme Court rules it's technically a breach of contract, but there's some technicalities that say it didn't matter because the bondholders still technically got paid, but they got paid in the dollars they didn't want. But interesting thing, over that course of time, FDR revalued gold at a higher rate, and so effectively devalued the dollar by about 40%. So everybody holding dollars, bondholders, all got screwed, right? Number two comes in 71. So now, after this, after World War II, the dollar becomes the default global currency for a number of nations as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. They all agree to peg their currencies to the value of the dollar, and the US, in turn, agrees to peg its dollar to the price of gold. Why they chose to do this after 1933 is beyond me, but I wasn't in the room. I don't know. So 1971 comes. Dollars are redeemable for gold. Again, great. The US is running enormous budget deficits. This was due to Vietnam, due to LBJ's expanded social safety programs, and foreign bondholders start redeeming treasuries for gold. So Nixon goes ahead and suspends the convertibility to gold. First, he says it was only temporary. Then, of course, obviously that wasn't the case. But my favorite thing about this, right? My favorite thing about this was Nixon's Treasury Secretary, John Connolly, said in front of a group of European finance ministers, "It's our dollar, but it's your problem," which I think was great. I mean, I'm I'm sure it pissed a lot of people off, but I thought that was absolutely fantastic. But the weird thing about these two things is the repercussions seem to be the U.S. retaining its role as the dominant global currency. In the case of Nixon, everybody let their currencies float. And now, of course, we are one of many Western nations who have racked up mountains and mountains and mountains of debt. Now, the interesting thing about this, and getting back to what I had said earlier about taxes, is when the dollar was allowed to float, when the dollar was no longer pegged to the value of gold, the US government began racking up more and more debt. There's almost a straight line. If you go back to the rise in US debt to GDP, it almost starts when Nixon closes the gold window. And the financial sector as a total percentage of the economy starts to increase. Income inequality starts to grow.
Mhm.
And what we start to see is more and more of that loose monetary policy results in inflated asset prices. And so it's really my belief that when we look at the economic state of affairs today and we look at income inequality, it's largely driven by loose monetary policy. Obviously, there were some, obviously it kind of shifted into high gear after the financial crisis, first through quantitative easing, then through COVID stimulus and whatnot. But the bottom line is US monetary policy has effectively goosed the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
It has made the ultra wealthy ultra wealthier. And so this is why I am a big fan of progressive taxes that happen to target those who make and have most of their money in investable assets, because they are partially rich because they built businesses. So, for example, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg obviously built profitable businesses, but not that profitable. And a lot of their wealth is a direct result of zero interest rate policies. And I think as a result, it's only fair that some of that wealth be siphoned back and used to pay down the debt that fueled the expansion of asset prices.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been very patient with me, Shawn. I'm going to land this plane for you. We had FDR, we had Nixon. Let's just say we reach this inflection point with the dollar, the debt market. Bondholders are fed up. I don't say a lot of good things about Trump on this podcast, but I will say, if we need a president who's going to screw over the bondholders, I can't imagine anybody better than Trump. I mean, can you?
I mean, yeah, that's a fair point. What I will say, however, is I'm very concerned about the state of affairs and the way things are going to move under a system in which this entire bill, this one big beautiful bill act, was constructed was just to please Trump, and that in itself is a problem when you are constructing monetary policy to not just benefit a single party, but a single individual or a small subsection of individuals within the country that just happen to make the most money in the country. Not only are you going to see an increase in problems like wealth inequality, but you are going to see a rapid decline in financial credibility with the U.S. and just an uncertainty about our financial future going forward.
That is the truth. That is the truth. And I would say you couple the runaway deficits with a somewhat erratic economic policy, especially when it comes to tariffs.
Yeah.
And you could potentially see a decline of foreign direct investment. So there are definitely some bigger blowback effects that could happen there. Here's a big question I have, and I'm interested in your take on this. So normally we end every episode with the understanding that in order for things to change, we really need to open up the two parties to political competition, right? In the case of this budget, it's a very partisan budget. And so you could argue that this budget would be different if there were more political voices in the room, right?
Yeah.
That being said, I find it very, very hard to imagine that any sort of representative democracy is going to be able to have any sort of fiscal discipline when the political advantage to higher spending with lower taxes is just so attractive. Deficit spending is politically attractive.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't know if there's anything that would stop that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any sort of reform, any sort of electoral reform that will get us to a position where, say, we could balance the budget again like we did in the 90s. I do not see us ever accomplishing that ever again. And part of that is the political dysfunction, but also we have embraced deficit spending so much in this country that we have crossed a point of no return when it comes to that. Now, I do believe that it is possible with more accountable representation to get reconciliation bills like this that are more catered to a broader segment of the electorate rather than just the few and the minority, and serving to cater the interest of a partisan base as opposed to the electorate at large. Again, the passage of this bill came not even a week after Moody's downgraded our credit rating because of the state of our debt and deficit spending. So I do think that reforming our elections is very critical to bringing greater accountability, more representation, more competition into the process. But yes, I think we have reached a state that no matter who's in charge, whether it's conservatives or progressives, and we've kind of already seen this already, deficit spending is just an attractive thing to those who are in power.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful place to cap it off. We are going to leave it there. Thank you again for listening. We will be back next week with another radical centrist banger. The music you are listening to is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.